My parents abandoned me at 18 for their hedonistic lifestyle. 8 years later, they returned for my $3 million inheritance, but I exposed their darkest secret. I'm Sarah Mitchell and I'm 26. The mahogany doors of Whitmore and Associates law firm swung shut behind my parents with the satisfying thud of justice being served. Just 30 minutes ago, they'd walked in here expecting to control $3 million and a mansion that belonged to me. They thought showing up after 8 years of radio silence would be enough. "We're your legal guardians," my father had announced, like I was still the broken 18-year-old they dumped at Uncle Robert's doorstep. "We'll manage this inheritance responsibly." My mother had nodded with that fake concerned expression she'd perfected. "You're too young for this kind of money, honey. You'll just waste it." I'd sat there, hands folded, listening to them plot my financial future. The same people who'd chosen their addictions over raising me were now worried about responsibility. Rich, right? Then I'd reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope Uncle Robert had given me 3 months before he died. "Before we discuss anything," I'd said, sliding it across the polished conference table to Mr. Whitmore. "Perhaps you should read this." The moment Mr. Whitmore opened it, my parents' faces went from smug to terrified. Dad actually started hyperventilating. Mom grabbed his arm like she was drowning. See, 8 years ago, when my parents decided their drug habits were more important than their only daughter, they didn't just abandon me. They did something much worse, something they thought no one would ever discover. Uncle Robert had been my father's older brother, the successful one who'd built a construction empire while my dad bounced between get-rich-quick schemes and rehab centers. When my parents showed up at his house that October night, strung out and desperate, they'd begged him to take me in. Just temporarily, they had promised, until we get clean. Uncle Robert had opened his home to me without hesitation. He'd enrolled me in private school, taught me about business, treated me like the daughter he never had. But more importantly, he'd investigated exactly why my parents had really given me up. The house they'd been living in, foreclosed 3 months before they brought me to Robert's. The car they'd driven, repossessed 2 weeks later. The money they claimed they needed time to earn back, stolen from their previous employer, a fact that led to felony charges they'd managed to avoid only by fleeing the state. They hadn't placed me with Uncle Robert out of love or concern for my welfare. They'd used me as their escape plan, knowing Robert's good heart would keep me safe while they ran from the law. I'd been their insurance policy, a way to ensure their daughter would be cared for while they disappeared to avoid prison. For 8 years, I'd wondered why they never called, never visited, never even sent a birthday card. Now I understood. They couldn't risk being found, but Uncle Robert had found them anyway. Private investigators are expensive, but when you're worth millions, money isn't an obstacle. He'd tracked their movements through Nevada, California, Oregon. He documented their arrests, their stints in county jails, their pattern of using fake names and stolen identities. More importantly, he'd discovered they'd never actually gotten clean. The heroin addiction that had destroyed their marriage, their home, and their relationship with me had only gotten worse. They had supported their habits through small-time fraud, theft, and manipulation. They were career criminals now, not struggling parents trying to rebuild their lives. When Uncle Robert got sick last year, he'd shared all of this with me. The files were thick, filled with police reports, employment records, and photographs that showed the hollow-eyed shells my parents had become. "They'll come for the money when I'm gone," he'd warned me, his voice weak from chemotherapy. "People like that always do. They can smell inheritance like vultures smell death." He'd been right, of course. The funeral was on a Thursday. By Sunday, they were calling me. "Sarah, honey, we heard about Robert," my mother had said, her voice artificially sweet. "We're so sorry for your loss. We know how much he meant to you." The conversation had been carefully choreographed. First, they'd expressed sympathy. Then, they'd asked about the will. Finally, they'd suggested a family meeting to discuss my future. I'd agreed, mostly out of morbid curiosity. I wanted to see if 8 years had changed them at all, if there was any genuine parental concern beneath their obvious greed. There wasn't. They'd spent the car ride from the airport to the law office outlining their plans for my inheritance. A trust fund, they'd explained, with them as trustees. Regular allowances instead of lump sums, investment strategies that would preserve the money for my future. It would have sounded reasonable if I hadn't known the truth. Mr. Whitmore finished reading Uncle Robert's letter and set it down carefully. His expression was grave as he looked at my parents, who seemed to shrink in their leather chairs. "This is quite comprehensive," he said slowly. "I'm afraid there are some legal matters we need to discuss before we can proceed with anything regarding Miss Mitchell's inheritance." Dad found his voice first. "What kind of legal matters? The kind that involve outstanding warrants in 3 states?" I said calmly, pulling out my phone. "The kind that involve fraud, theft, and identity theft charges." Mom's face went completely white. "You don't understand, Sarah. We were sick. We made mistakes, but we've changed. Have you?" I asked. "Because according to the private investigator Uncle Robert hired, you were arrested in Portland just 6 months ago for running a credit card scam." The silence in that room was beautiful. Dad started to stand, but Mr. Whitmore raised his hand. "I think it's best if you remain seated, Mr. Mitchell. We have several more documents to review." "This is insane," Mom whispered. "We're her parents. We have rights." "Actually," Mr. Whitmore said, opening another folder. "You forfeited parental rights when you abandoned your minor child 8 years ago." Mr. Robert Mitchell was granted legal guardianship, which remained in effect until Miss Mitchell turned 21. "But we never signed papers," Dad protested. "You didn't need to. Abandonment for more than 6 months constitutes relinquishment under state law." I watched my parents' faces as their scheme crumbled. The money they traveled across the country to claim was never going to be theirs. The daughter they'd planned to manipulate was no longer the helpless teenager they'd left behind. But I wasn't finished yet. Uncle Robert hadn't just protected my inheritance. He'd given me the tools to ensure my parents could never hurt me again. The real surprise was still coming. The second envelope was smaller, but its contents would destroy any remaining hope my parents had of manipulating me. Uncle Robert had been thorough in ways I was only beginning to understand. "There's more?" Dad asked, his voice cracking slightly. Mr. Whitmore nodded, sliding the new documents across the table. "Your brother was quite meticulous in his preparations, Mr. Mitchell. I'd read these papers 3 months ago, but watching my parents discover them now felt like watching karma in real time." The first document was a detailed financial analysis of their activities over the past 8 years, compiled by a team of forensic accountants. They'd stolen more than just the money from Dad's former employer. Credit cards opened in dead relatives' names. Government benefits claimed fraudulently. Elderly victims conned out of retirement savings. The list was extensive and damning. But the second document was the real bombshell, a formal complaint filed with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit detailing their pattern of interstate fraud. Uncle Robert had died before he could submit it, but he'd left clear instructions. If my parents ever attempted to contact me regarding money or inheritance, Mr. Whitmore was to file the complaint immediately. "This can't be legal," Mom said, her voice shaking. "You can't just threaten us like this." "It's not a threat," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. "It's consequences. For the first time in your lives, you're facing actual consequences." Dad stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "We're leaving. Come on, Margaret. We don't have to listen to this." "Actually, you do," Mr. Whitmore said quietly. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Security is already stationed outside. At this point, you're welcome to leave, but local police have been notified of your presence in the city." I had to admire Uncle Robert's planning. He'd anticipated every possible reaction, every escape route my parents might attempt. Even in death, he was still protecting me. "Sarah," Mom said, turning to me with tears in her eyes. "We know we made mistakes, but we're still your parents. Doesn't that count for something?" For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old Sarah, the one who'd spent years hoping they'd come back. Who'd made excuses for their absence. Who'd believed they loved her despite abandoning her. Then I remembered the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering what I'd done wrong. The school events where Uncle Robert sat alone in the parents section because my real parents were too high or too scared to show up. The birthday cards I'd written and never sent. The phone calls I'd planned and never made. The hope that had slowly died as year after year passed without contact. Being a parent is about showing up, I said. It's about choosing your child over everything else, including your addiction. You chose drugs over me when I was 18. You chose your freedom over me for 8 years. Now you're choosing money over me again. That's not fair, Dad protested. Fair? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what fair looks like. I reached into my purse and pulled out a third envelope. One Mr. Whitmore hadn't seen. Uncle Robert had given this one directly to me with instructions to open it only if this moment came. Inside were photographs. Pictures of me at high school graduation with Uncle Robert beaming beside me and 2 empty seats in the row behind us marked reserved for family. Pictures of me at college orientation, again with Uncle Robert, while other families took group photos with both parents present. But the most devastating photo was from 2 years ago. A newspaper clipping showing me receiving an award for volunteer work at the local children's hospital. In the background, clearly visible, were my parents entering what was obviously a casino. They'd been in town. They'd been less than 5 miles away from me, and they hadn't bothered to make contact. Fair, I repeated, sliding the photograph across the table. Is you learning what abandonment feels like? Mom stared at the picture, her face crumpling. We didn't know you were. You didn't care enough to find out? I cut her off. But I'm curious about something. How exactly did you know Uncle Robert had died? I never called you. The obituary only ran in local papers. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. We kept track, Dad finally admitted. You kept track of Uncle Robert's health, but not mine. You monitored his financial status, but never checked if I was alive or dead. You researched property records and investment portfolios, but never once tried to find out if I graduated high school. I stood up, smoothing down my black dress. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. Miss Mitchell, there are a few more items your uncle wanted you to have today. He handed me a sealed letter with my name written in Uncle Robert's familiar handwriting. I'd seen him write thousands of notes over the years, but this one felt different. Final. He asked me to give this to you after your parents had seen the other documents, Mr. Whitmore explained. I opened it carefully, aware that my parents were watching my every movement. My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then the people who should have been your greatest protectors have proven once again that they care more about money than they care about you. I'm sorry you had to discover this truth, but I'm proud of how you've handled it. The inheritance is yours, free and clear. But more than that, the life you've built is yours. The education, the values, the strength you've developed over these 8 years. No one can take those away from you. Your parents will likely make one final attempt to guilt you into giving them money. They may claim to be clean, to need help, to have changed. They haven't. Addiction without recovery is just delayed destruction. Remember, you don't owe them anything. Not money, not forgiveness, not even acknowledgement. They made their choices and now they have to live with them. Be happy, my dear girl. You deserve everything good this world has to offer. Love, Uncle Robert. P.S. Check the safety deposit box, box 847 at First National. The key is with Whitmore. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my purse. My parents were staring at me expectantly, probably hoping Uncle Robert had encouraged reconciliation or family healing. What did he say? Mom asked softly. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd given birth to me, but had never actually been a mother. She looked older than her 52 years, worn down by addiction and poor choices. Dad wasn't much better, his once handsome face now gaunt and marked by years of hard living. For just a second, I considered lying, telling them Uncle Robert had encouraged forgiveness or suggested I help them get back on their feet. It would have been the kind thing to do. But kindness hadn't protected me 8 years ago, and it wouldn't protect me now. He said you haven't changed, I replied. And he was right. I turned to Mr. Whitmore. I'd like to proceed with filing that FBI complaint now. The sound my mother made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, but I was done being their victim. The safety deposit box contained the final piece of Uncle Robert's elaborate chess game, and it was the move that would change everything. Mr. Whitmore and I drove to First National Bank in silence, leaving my parents at his office with strict instructions not to leave the building. The bank manager, Mrs. Henderson, had known Uncle Robert for 15 years. She led us through the vault with the reverence usually reserved for entering a cathedral. "He visited this box just 3 weeks before he passed," she said quietly. Added several items and updated his instructions. Box 847 was larger than I'd expected. Inside, Uncle Robert had organized everything with his characteristic precision: labeled folders, sealed envelopes, and a handwritten inventory of contents. The first folder contained adoption papers I'd never seen before. Official documents showing that Uncle Robert had filed for legal adoption when I turned 19. My parents had been served notice, but they'd never responded because they were using fake names in Nevada at the time. Legally, Uncle Robert hadn't just been my guardian. He'd been my father for the last 7 years of his life. The second folder was labeled insurance policies, but it contained much more than that. Life insurance, yes, but also documentation proving that my parents had attempted to take out policies on Uncle Robert's life 3 different times over the past 5 years. Each application had been flagged by insurance companies as potentially fraudulent. They hadn't just planned to inherit from me. They'd planned to inherit from him. But the third folder was the nuclear option. Bank records showing that my parents had emptied my college fund when I was 17, stealing nearly $40,000 Uncle Robert had been saving for my education. They'd used the money to buy drugs and fund a cross-country trip that ended with their arrest in California. Uncle Robert had replaced the money without telling me, paying for my entire college education out of his own pocket while quietly documenting their theft. "I need to make some phone calls," I told Mr. Whitmore, starting with Detective Morrison at the Financial Crimes Unit. The drive back to his office felt different now. I wasn't just a young woman protecting an inheritance anymore. I was someone who'd discovered the full extent of her parents' betrayal and was finally in a position to do something about it. My parents were still in the conference room when we returned, but they'd aged a decade in the 2 hours we'd been gone. Dad was pacing by the window while Mom sat hunched over in her chair, crying quietly. "Find anything interesting?" Dad asked with false bravado when I walked in. I set the folders on the table without a word. The adoption papers went first, followed by the insurance fraud evidence. And finally, the college fund theft documentation. "Oh God," Mom whispered when she saw the bank statements. "Sarah, we can explain." "Stop." My voice was sharper than I intended. "Just stop." I'd spent 8 years making excuses for them, telling myself they were sick, that addiction was a disease, that they had abandoned me because they were too broken to be parents. Some part of me had always held on to the hope that underneath the drugs and chaos, they still loved me. But love doesn't steal from your child's college fund. Love doesn't attempt insurance fraud against the person caring for your daughter. Love doesn't track someone's death for inheritance purposes while ignoring that same daughter for nearly a decade. "The police are on their way," I said calmly. "Detective Morrison is very interested in talking to you both." Dad's face went pale. "You called the cops on us?" "I called the cops on 2 people who have been committing fraud for years and recently attempted to steal from me. The fact that you happen to share my DNA is irrelevant. Sarah, please." Mom begged, reaching across the table toward me. "We know we've made mistakes, but we're still family. You can't just..." I pulled my hand away before she could touch it. "We stopped being family 8 years ago. What we are now is strangers with shared genetics and a very long list of crimes between us." Mr. Whitmore checked his watch. Detective Morrison said 20 minutes. "She's bringing a warrant." "A warrant?" Dad's voice cracked. "For what?" "Interstate fraud, identity theft, insurance fraud, theft from a minor, and conspiracy," I recited from memory. "Plus whatever charges come from the FBI complaint I filed an hour ago." The silence that followed was beautiful. For years, I'd imagined what it would be like to see my parents again, to tell them how their abandonment had affected me, to demand explanations for their choices. I'd never imagined this, watching them realize that their past had finally caught up with them. "We could run," Dad said quietly to Mom. "Leave now before the cops get here." "Where?" Mom asked hopelessly. "We don't have money for gas, much less another cross-country trip." And Sarah's made sure every police department in the country knows who we are now. You could have avoided all of this, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. 8 years ago, you could have chosen recovery over addiction. 5 years ago, you could have chosen honest work over fraud. Last week, you could have chosen to make contact because you missed me, not because you wanted money. We did miss you, Mom said desperately. Every day, Sarah. Every single day. But not enough to get clean. Not enough to call. Not enough to choose me over everything else in your lives. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city Uncle Robert had taught me to love. In a few minutes, police would arrive and arrest the people who'd given me life but never actually lived up to the title of parents. Tomorrow, I'd wake up as an orphan by choice rather than circumstance. For what it's worth, I said without turning around. I forgive you for abandoning me. 18-year-olds are resilient, and Uncle Robert gave me everything I needed to build a good life. I heard Mom's sharp intake of breath, hope creeping into her voice. Then why? But I'll never forgive you for what you did after, I continued. For staying away when you could have come home, for choosing drugs over recovery, fraud over honest work, greed over love, for tracking Uncle Robert's illness like vultures circling carrion. Detective Morrison's arrival was announced by the sound of car doors slamming in the parking lot below. And I'll never forgive you for making me choose between family and self-respect. I finished, finally turning to face them. You forced me to become someone who calls the police on her own parents. That's not the person Uncle Robert raised me to be. Dad started crying then. Deep, broken sobs that might have moved me if I hadn't spent 8 years crying for parents who never came home. We're sorry. He managed between sobs. Sarah, I know you are, I said gently. But sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't give me back my childhood or Uncle Robert's stolen money or all those other people you've hurt over the years. Sorry is just a word. The conference room door opened and Detective Morrison entered with 2 uniformed officers. She was a tall woman with graying hair and kind eyes that probably made suspects forget how smart she was. Miss Mitchell, she said, extending her hand. I'm Detective Morrison. I understand you have some information for us. Everything you need is in these folders, I replied, gesturing to the table. Financial records, documentation of fraud, evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Detective Morrison picked up the first folder and scanned its contents. Her eyebrows rose slightly as she read. This is quite comprehensive, she said. How long have you been gathering this information? My uncle spent 8 years collecting it, I answered. He always said the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Margaret and Daniel Mitchell, Detective Morrison said, looking at my parents. You're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As the officers handcuffed my parents and read them their rights, Mom looked at me one last time. I love you, Sarah, she said, tears streaming down her face. Whatever you think of us, please know that we love you. I stared at her for a long moment. This broken woman who'd given birth to me, but had never learned how to be a mother. Love is a choice, I said finally. And you've spent 8 years choosing everything else. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself? How do you balance forgiveness with accountability when the people who hurt you are your own blood? I'd love to hear your perspective on this impossible situation. 3 days after my parents' arrest, I was finally alone in Uncle Robert's house, my house now, trying to process what felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The silence was profound in a way I'd never experienced before. No more waiting for parents who would never come home. No more wondering if I was worth loving. No more carrying the weight of their abandonment like a stone in my chest. The house felt different, too. Lighter somehow, as if Uncle Robert's spirit had been waiting for this resolution before finding peace. I walked through rooms filled with memories of the man who'd saved me, touching objects that told the story of our 8 years together. His desk in the study still held the fountain pen he'd used to write me notes for school lunches. The kitchen counter bore the ring stains from his coffee mug, which he'd set down in the exact same spot every morning while reading the financial section. His bedroom still smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that had always meant safety to me. But it was in his closet that I found the final surprise. Behind his winter coats, pushed far back against the wall, was a trunk I'd never seen before. It was old military style with brass corners and a lock that opened with a small key I found taped to the inside lid. Inside were photo albums, dozens of them, chronicling my life from the day I'd arrived at his house as a scared, angry 18-year-old. Pictures I'd never known he'd taken. Me doing homework at the kitchen table, laughing at something on television, working in the garden behind the house. But more than that, there were letters, hundreds of them, addressed to my dear daughter Sarah, written but never sent. I sat on his bedroom floor and read them chronologically, watching my life through his eyes. Letters about his pride when I made the dean's list. Letters about his worry when I went on my first date. Letters about his joy when I decided to major in business, following in his footsteps. And threaded throughout, his growing love for the girl who'd been dropped into his life by tragedy, but had become his greatest blessing. October 15th. Sarah's been here 3 months now. She still flinches when I raise my voice, even when I'm just calling to her from another room. What did those people do to this child? But she laughed today at dinner, really laughed, and for a moment I saw who she could become. December 3rd. Parent-teacher conferences today. Sarah's chemistry teacher called her a joy to have in class. I nearly cried right there in that tiny plastic chair. When was the last time anyone called this girl a joy? March 22nd. Sarah asked if she could call me Dad today. I said yes so fast I probably scared her, but the smile on her face. I'd give up every penny I have to see that smile every day for the rest of my life. June 12th. High school graduation. Sarah wore the dress I bought her and looked like a princess. Her real parents didn't show, but I filled that empty seat in my heart with pride. She's mine now. Truly mine, and I'm the luckiest man alive. I was crying by the time I reached the letters from my college years. When Uncle Robert had learned to express his love through care packages and phone calls, never wanting to hover, but always wanting me to know I was cherished. September 15th. Sarah called tonight to tell me about her economics professor. She's found her passion and it's beautiful to witness. I never had children of my own. Never knew what I was missing, but watching this brilliant girl discover her potential. There's no greater privilege. November 8th. Sarah brought a boy home for Thanksgiving. Nice kid, respectful, made her laugh, but more importantly, he looked at her like she hung the moon. She deserves that. She deserves everything. The final letter was dated just 2 weeks before his death. My dear daughter Sarah. The doctors tell me I have weeks, not months. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm terrified of leaving you alone. Not because you can't handle whatever comes next, you're the strongest person I know, but because I want to see everything you'll accomplish. You asked me once why I took you in, why I didn't just send you to foster care or let child services handle your situation. The truth is, I was selfish. My house was too quiet. My life too empty. You didn't just need rescuing. I did, too. But somewhere along the way, loving you stopped being charity and became the greatest joy of my life. You weren't my duty or my burden. You were my daughter as surely as if I'd been there the day you were born. When your biological parents come, and they will come, remember that love isn't determined by genetics. Love is shown through action, through choice, through showing up every single day. By that measure, you've been my daughter for 8 years, and I've been your father. The money I'm leaving you isn't just inheritance. It's investment capital for the life you're going to build. Use it wisely, but more importantly, use it joyfully. Travel, explore, take chances, make mistakes. Live the life I never got to have. And Sarah, don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. The people who love you will understand. The people who don't understand were never really on your side anyway. You are loved beyond measure. Dad, Robert. I sat in his closet for an hour, surrounded by the evidence of a love I'd felt but never fully comprehended. Uncle Robert hadn't just taken me in. He'd chosen me deliberately and completely every single day for 8 years. When I finally stood up, brushing tears from my face, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete certainty about who I was and where I belonged. Not with the people who'd abandoned me, but with the memory of the man who'd shown me what unconditional love looked like. The house phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I almost didn't answer, assuming it would be another reporter or curious neighbor wanting details about my parents' arrest, but the caller ID showed Detective Morrison's number. Miss Mitchell, I wanted to update you on your parents' situation. Are they still in custody? Yes, and they'll likely remain so for some time. The FBI complaint triggered a multi-state investigation. We're finding victims in Nevada, California, Oregon, and Washington. The charges are mounting. I should have felt satisfaction, but instead I felt only a dull ache. How long? If they're convicted on all charges, 15 to 20 years, possibly more. 20 years. They'd be in their 70s when they got out. If they got out, I'd be in my mid-40s, probably married. Maybe with children they'd never meet. Miss Mitchell, are you there? Yes. Sorry. Is there anything else I need to do? Actually, yes. Their defense attorney wants to arrange a meeting. He thinks they might be willing to plead guilty in exchange for reduced sentences, but only if you agree to speak on their behalf at sentencing. I almost laughed. Even facing decades in prison, they were trying to use me. Tell their attorney I'll consider it, I said. But not for the reasons he thinks. After hanging up, I walked through the house one more time, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just the place where I'd lived for 8 years. It was home in every sense that mattered. These walls held memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, homework sessions, and heart-to-heart talks. All the ordinary moments that had built an extraordinary relationship. Uncle Robert had given me more than money and property. He'd given me a foundation, a sense of worth, and an understanding of what real love looked like. My biological parents had given me life, but he'd taught me how to live it. The question now was what to do with that gift. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Jenny, it's Sarah Mitchell. I know it's been a while, but I wanted to ask you something. Are you still running that nonprofit for kids aging out of foster care? Jenny's voice brightened immediately. Sarah, of course I am. Why? Because I think I might have a way to help. Are you free for coffee tomorrow? I have a proposition for you. As I hung up, I felt Uncle Robert's presence in the room, almost as if he were nodding approvingly. The money he'd left me was meant to be invested in life, and I couldn't think of a better investment than helping kids who'd been abandoned like I was. My parents had taught me what I didn't want to become. Uncle Robert had shown me who I could be. Now it was time to choose which legacy I'd carry forward. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the beginning of a life I'd build entirely on my own terms. But for tonight, I was content to sit in the house that love had built, surrounded by the evidence of what family really meant. Some families are born, others are chosen. I'd been lucky enough to experience both the pain of the first and the joy of the second. The coffee shop where I'd arranged to meet Jenny was bustling with the usual morning crowd, but I spotted her immediately. She hadn't changed much in the 3 years since we'd graduated together. Still the same auburn curls, still wearing clothes that looked like they'd been selected more for comfort than fashion. Jenny Morrison had been my study partner in business ethics class, but more than that, she'd been someone who understood what it felt like to grow up without reliable parents. Her foster care experience had been different from my abandonment story. But we'd recognized the same weariness in each other, the same careful way we approached relationships. Sarah Mitchell, she said, standing to hug me. Look at you all mysterious with your early morning phone calls. What's going on? I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head, but sitting across from her now, I realized I'd never actually talked to anyone about my parents' return or the inheritance. The whole situation felt surreal even to me. You remember my Uncle Robert, the one who raised me? Of course. He came to graduation, right? Seemed like a really good guy. He died 6 months ago. Left me everything. His construction company, $3 million, and the house. Jenny's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Holy, Sarah. I mean, I'm sorry for your loss, but wow. That's not the crazy part, I continued. The crazy part is what happened when my biological parents found out about the inheritance. I told her everything, the surprise appearance at the lawyer's office, the documents Uncle Robert had compiled, the arrest 3 days ago. Jenny listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to anger to something that looked like admiration. So, your parents who abandoned you 8 years ago showed up trying to control your inheritance and you had them arrested for fraud. She summarized when I finished. Pretty much. That's actually badass, Sarah. I mean, I can't imagine how hard it must have been, but good for you for not letting them manipulate you. Here's the thing, though, I said, leaning forward. I don't want to be defined by what they did to me. Uncle Robert left me this money to build something positive, and I keep thinking about all the kids who age out of foster care with nowhere to go. Jenny's eyes lit up. You want to donate to the center? I want to do more than that. I want to expand it. Create a comprehensive program that doesn't just provide temporary housing, but job training, college scholarships, mentoring, even small business loans for kids who want to start their own companies. Sarah, that would be incredible. But do you have any idea how much something like that would cost? A lot, I admitted. Which is why I want to talk to you about coming on board as executive director. Full salary, benefits, and a budget that would let you actually help kids instead of just warehousing them until they're 18. Jenny stared at me for a long moment. You're serious? Dead serious. I've been thinking about this since I read Uncle Robert's letter yesterday. He told me the money was investment capital for the life I wanted to build. Well, I want to build a life that matters. And I can't think of anything that matters more than making sure kids don't go through what we went through. What we went through was different, though, Jenny pointed out. You had your uncle. I bounced between foster homes until I aged out. But we both know what it's like to feel disposable, I said. To wonder if anyone would notice if we just disappeared, to build walls around ourselves because trusting adults felt too dangerous. Jenny nodded slowly. The kids I work with now, some of them, God, Sarah, some of their stories would break your heart. 18 years old and living in their cars or couch surfing or worse. The system just cuts them loose and expects them to figure out how to be adults overnight. So, let's fix that, I said simply. Not for every kid everywhere, but for as many as we can reach. Have you thought about the logistics, location, staffing, licensing requirements? Some. I figured that's where you'd come in. You understand the regulatory side and you already have relationships with social services. Jenny pulled out her phone and started making notes. We'd need residential facilities, but also life skills training, financial literacy programs, partnership with local community colleges. Whatever it takes, I interrupted. Within reason, obviously, but money isn't the limiting factor here. Sarah, this is a lot. Are you sure you want to commit this much of your inheritance to something like this? I thought about Uncle Robert's letters, about the love and investment he'd poured into me, about the difference between my parents, who'd seen me as either a burden or a potential source of income, and the man who'd seen me as a person worth saving. My parents spent 8 years proving they saw me as disposable, I said. Uncle Robert spent 8 years proving the opposite. If I can give even one kid the kind of security and support he gave me, then yeah, I want to commit everything to this. Jenny was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee cup. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You know what the hardest part about aging out of foster care was for me? She asked. It wasn't the practical stuff, although that was hell. It was the knowledge that there wasn't a single adult in the world who was required to care about me anymore. No one whose job it was to worry about whether I was eating or had a safe place to sleep. Exactly, I said. So, let's create that. Let's build a place where kids know someone is always in their corner, even when they screw up, even when they make mistakes. It won't be easy, Jenny warned. The kids who need this most are often the hardest to help. They've been hurt so many times that they'll push back against anyone who tries to get close. I know, but Uncle Robert didn't give up on me, even when I was angry and difficult and convinced that caring about people was just setting yourself up for disappointment. Jenny smiled. You were never that difficult. Cautious maybe, but not difficult. You didn't see me at 18. I was a mess. We all were. That's the point, isn't it? Someone saw past the mess to the person we could become. I nodded. So, what do you think? Are you interested in changing careers? Sarah, I've been dreaming about something like this since I started working with foster kids. The current system is so broken, so inadequate. If we could actually create something better, then let's do it. Jenny extended her hand across the table. Partners? I shook it. Partners. As we sat there planning and dreaming, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The satisfaction of turning pain into purpose. My parents' abandonment had led to Uncle Robert's love, which had led to this opportunity to help other abandoned kids. It wasn't that the pain had been worth it exactly, but maybe it could be transformed into something meaningful. There's one more thing, I said as we prepared to leave. My parents' sentencing is in a few months. Their lawyer wants me to speak on their behalf, asking for leniency. Are you going to do it? I'm thinking about it, but not in the way he expects. Jenny raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Meaning I might speak at their sentencing, but I'm not going to ask the judge to go easy on them. I'm going to tell the truth about what their choices cost. Not just me, but all the other people they hurt over the years. That's brave, Sarah, and probably the right thing to do. Uncle Robert always said that accountability and love aren't opposites. You can love someone and still hold them responsible for their actions. Smart man. The smartest, I agreed. As we walked out of the coffee shop, already making plans for our next meeting, I felt Uncle Robert's presence again. He'd given me the tools to build a life that mattered, and I was finally ready to use them. My parents had taught me what abandonment looked like. Uncle Robert had shown me what commitment looked like. Now it was my turn to show other kids the difference. 2 weeks later, I stood in the abandoned warehouse that would become the cornerstone of our program, watching Jenny pace excitedly through the empty space while rattling off renovation plans. This section could be individual studio apartments for the older kids, she said, gesturing to the east wing. And over here, we could have common areas, maybe a computer lab, definitely a commercial kitchen for teaching life skills. The warehouse was perfect, large enough to house 20 residents comfortably, zoned for mixed residential and educational use, and most importantly, available for a price that wouldn't devastate our startup budget. Uncle Robert's construction company had connections throughout the city, which had made finding the right property much easier than expected. The city inspector said we're looking at about 6 months for renovations if we hire the right contractors, I told Jenny as she examined the electrical systems along the north wall. Your uncle's company could handle most of this, right? Actually, that's something I wanted to talk to you about. I pulled out a folder thick with financial documents. I've been meeting with the company's management team, trying to figure out what to do with the business. Jenny stopped pacing and gave me her full attention. And they want to buy me out. Fair market value, which would give us another $2 million for the program, but it would also mean losing the construction connections. That's a big decision. It is, but I think it's the right one. The managers know the business better than I do, and they've been loyal to Uncle Robert for years. They deserve to own it. I'd spent countless hours agonizing over this decision. Uncle Robert's construction company wasn't just a business. It was his legacy built from nothing over 30 years of hard work and smart decisions. Selling felt like betraying his memory. But keeping it meant trying to manage something I didn't understand in an industry I had no experience with while also trying to launch a nonprofit that would require all of my attention. Uncle Robert had been practical above all else, and I knew he'd approve of the choice that would help more kids. Have you decided what to do about your parents' sentencing? Jenny asked as we made our way to what would eventually be the main office space. I'm going next month to speak, on behalf of their victims. All of them, including the 18-year-old girl they abandoned. Jenny nodded approvingly. Good. Accountability, right? Accountability, I agreed. My phone rang, interrupting our planning session. The caller ID showed Detective Morrison's number. Miss Mitchell, I have an update on your parents' case. What kind of update? They want to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for concurrent sentences of 12 years. The prosecutor is inclined to accept given the strength of the evidence and the cooperation they're showing. 12 years, still a significant chunk of their lives, but less than the 20 years we discussed earlier. What do you think? I asked. Honestly, 12 years is appropriate for the crimes they committed. They'll be out when they're in their mid-60s, old enough to have learned their lesson, but young enough to potentially rebuild their lives. And the victims, are they satisfied with this outcome? Most of them, yes. The financial restitution is more important to them than the length of incarceration. After hanging up, I found myself staring out the warehouse's grimy windows at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, my parents were sitting in jail cells, probably congratulating themselves on avoiding the full consequences of their actions. "Everything okay?" Jenny asked. "My parents are pleading guilty. 12 years. How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, relieved. A trial would have meant months of reliving their betrayal, and I'm ready to move forward." "But you're still planning to speak at the sentencing." "Especially now. The judge needs to understand the full impact of their choices. Not just the financial crimes, but the human cost." Jenny studied my face. "You've changed since all this started." "You know that?" "What do you mean?" "You're stronger, I guess. More certain of yourself. When we were in college, you always seemed like you were apologizing for taking up space. Now you're claiming space, making decisions, taking control." I considered this. She was right. Though I hadn't fully realized it myself, the girl who'd sat in that law office 2 weeks ago, nervously waiting to see if her parents would try to manipulate her, was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, who refused to be anyone's victim. Uncle Robert used to tell me that trauma could either make you smaller or make you stronger. But the choice was always mine, I said. I guess I finally chose stronger. Good choice. We spent another hour in the warehouse making lists and taking measurements, but my mind kept drifting to the sentencing hearing next month. I'd written my victim impact statement 3 different times, struggling to find the right balance between honesty and dignity. The first draft had been too angry, full of hurt and resentment that served no purpose beyond making me feel temporarily better. The second had been too forgiving, focused on their addiction and the systemic failures that had contributed to their choices. The third draft, which I'd finally settled on, was simply truthful. It acknowledged the pain their abandonment had caused, while also recognizing the strength I'd found in surviving it. It held them accountable without demonizing them, and it honored Uncle Robert's love without minimizing their failures. Most importantly, it was my story told in my voice without apology or equivocation. "Jenny," I said as we prepared to leave the warehouse, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if your biological parents had been different? If they'd been the kind of people who could have raised you?" Jenny was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Sometimes," she said finally, "but not as much as I used to. I think I've realized that the parents I needed weren't the ones who gave birth to me. They were the foster families who showed me kindness, the teachers who believed in me, the social workers who fought for me. Family isn't just genetics." "Exactly. Family is whoever shows up and stays. Whoever chooses to love you even when it's inconvenient or difficult." As we walked to our cars, I thought about Uncle Robert's letters, about the choice he'd made every day to be my father, about Jenny's willingness to leave her comfortable job to help me build something new, about the kids we'd soon be serving, who would learn that being abandoned by some people didn't mean being unworthy of love. My parents had taught me that people could choose to walk away. Uncle Robert had taught me that people could also choose to stay. Now I was learning that I could choose who to become in response to both lessons. The warehouse behind us would soon be filled with young people who'd been discarded by the adults who were supposed to protect them. But it would also be filled with staff members who'd chosen to stay, to fight, to prove that the system could work when run by people who understood what it felt like to need it. In 30 days, I'd stand in a courtroom and tell a judge exactly what my parents' choices had cost. But more importantly, I'd be able to tell him what I'd built from the wreckage they'd left behind. That felt like the most honest kind of justice. Tomorrow, Jenny and I would start interviewing architects and contractors. Next week, we'd begin the licensing process with the state. Next month, I'd face my parents one final time. And somewhere in the future, a scared 18-year-old would walk through our doors and learn what I'd learned. That being thrown away by some people didn't determine your worth. The real question was whether you could find the people who would choose to keep you. The phone call that changed everything came at 6 in the morning, 3 weeks before my parents' sentencing hearing. I'd been deep in blueprints and budget spreadsheets when Detective Morrison's voice cut through my morning routine like a blade. "Miss Mitchell, we have a problem. Your parents' case has taken an unexpected turn." I sat down my coffee cup, instantly awake. "What kind of turn?" They're claiming they have information about additional crimes. Crimes involving you and your uncle's estate. Their lawyer filed a motion yesterday requesting a plea hearing. That's impossible. Uncle Robert was completely legitimate in his business dealings. They're not alleging financial impropriety, Detective Morrison said carefully. They're claiming your uncle coerced them into abandoning you by threatening to expose previous criminal activity. They say they were blackmailed into staying away. The silence that followed felt like falling through ice. My parents, facing 12 years in prison, were now trying to destroy Uncle Robert's reputation and paint themselves as victims of his manipulation. That's a lie, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I believe you, but their lawyer has submitted what appears to be documentation. Old letters, bank records, phone records. The prosecutor wants to investigate before finalizing the plea agreement. Meaning what exactly? Meaning the sentencing is postponed indefinitely while we sort through these allegations. After hanging up, I sat in Uncle Robert's kitchen, my kitchen, staring at the morning light filtering through windows he'd cleaned just before his diagnosis. In death, he couldn't defend himself against accusations that would rewrite our entire relationship if anyone believed them. But I could defend him, and I would. The first call I made was to Mr. Whitmore, Uncle Robert's lawyer. The second was to Jenny, who arrived at my house within 30 minutes carrying coffee and righteous indignation. This is despicable, she said, spreading the legal documents Detective Morrison had emailed across my dining room table. Even for people who stole from their own daughter's college fund, this is a new low. I read through my parents' claims with growing disgust. According to their sworn statements, Uncle Robert had discovered their criminal activities in Nevada and threatened to expose them unless they permanently severed contact with me. They painted themselves as loving parents forced to make an impossible choice, abandon their daughter or face decades in prison. It's almost believable, I admitted reluctantly. If you didn't know Uncle Robert, if you didn't understand how he really felt about me, you might think he was capable of this. But we do know him, Jenny said firmly. And more importantly, you have evidence that contradicts every word of this. She was right. Uncle Robert's letters, the photo albums, the detailed documentation of their crimes, it all painted a very different picture. But would it be enough to counter their accusations in court? There's something else, I said, pulling out a folder I discovered the night before while going through Uncle Robert's personal papers. I found this in his safe. The folder contained correspondence between Uncle Robert and a private investigator, but not the one who'd tracked my parents' criminal activities. This investigator had been hired to monitor my parents' attempts to contact me over the years. Look at this, I said, pointing to a report dated 3 years ago. They tried to find me when I graduated college. The investigator documented 17 different attempts to locate me through social media, alumni directories, even employment records. Jenny scanned the document. If they were being blackmailed into staying away, why were they actively trying to find you? Exactly. And look at this one from last year. I showed her another report. They hired their own investigator to research Uncle Robert's health and financial status. They were planning this inheritance grab long before he died. This proves they're lying. It proves they're desperate. Desperate enough to destroy a dead man's reputation to save themselves. The real question was whether I was strong enough to fight this battle. Taking on their initial criminal charges had been straightforward. I'd had evidence, law enforcement support, and clear moral ground. This was different. This was warfare. Jenny must have seen something in my expression because she reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Sarah, you don't have to do this alone. Whatever legal fight comes next, I'm with you. The nonprofit can wait if it has to. No, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. The nonprofit can't wait. There are kids who need what we're building, and I won't let my parents' lies delay that by even one day. Then what's the plan? I thought about Uncle Robert's letters, about the love and patience he'd shown me even when I'd been difficult and suspicious. He'd never once made me feel like a burden or an obligation. Every memory I had contradicted my parents' narrative. We build a war room, I said. We gather every piece of evidence that shows what our relationship really was. Photos, school records, medical records, financial documents, witness statements from neighbors and teachers and anyone who saw us together over the years. That's going to be a lot of work. Good thing I have time and money. I smiled for the first time since Detective Morrison's call. And it's going to be therapeutic. What do you think will happen next? Will Sarah be able to expose her parents' lies and protect her uncle's memory? I have a feeling you're not going to believe what happens at the courthouse. Over the next week, my dining room transformed into a command center. Jenny and I worked 12-hour days cataloging 8 years of evidence that told the real story of my relationship with Uncle Robert. We interviewed neighbors who'd watched him teach me to drive in the driveway. We gathered school records showing him at every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every graduation ceremony. Mrs. Henderson from the bank provided documentation of Uncle Robert's methodical approach to protecting my inheritance, including the establishment of educational trusts and careful investment strategies that spoke to long-term planning, not sudden guilty conscience. But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source. Uncle Robert's cardiologist, Dr. Williams, who treated him for the heart condition that eventually led to his cancer diagnosis. Your uncle talked about you constantly during his appointments, Dr. Williams told me over the phone. For 3 years, every visit included updates about your college progress, your career plans, your personal life. He was incredibly proud of you. Would you be willing to provide a statement to that effect? Absolutely. But there's something else you should know. About 6 months before his death, your uncle asked me to help him understand his prognosis in terms of your future. He wanted to make sure he lived long enough to see you established in your career. What do you mean? He was planning to tell you about his illness after you graduated and found your first job. He didn't want his health problems to interfere with your education or early career development. That's not the behavior of someone who felt guilty about separating a loving family. That's the behavior of a devoted father putting his daughter's needs first. By the time we finished compiling evidence, we had a timeline that completely contradicted my parents' version of events. Uncle Robert's love for me was documented in medical appointments, financial planning, school involvement, and hundreds of small gestures that spoke to genuine care rather than guilty obligation. But I knew my parents' lawyer would argue that all of this could be explained as elaborate cover for Uncle Robert's supposed blackmail scheme. I needed something more definitive, something that would expose their lies beyond any doubt. That's when I remembered Uncle Robert's most private possession, his daily journals, which he'd kept for over 20 years. They were locked in his bedroom safe, and I'd never felt comfortable reading them. But now, his reputation and my future depended on understanding his most private thoughts. The journals were leather-bound, filled with Uncle Robert's careful handwriting, documenting everything from business decisions to weather patterns to his thoughts about raising me. I started with the entries from the week my parents had brought me to his house 8 years ago. October 12th. Margaret called tonight crying. Says she and Daniel are in trouble. Need someone to watch Sarah for a few weeks while they sort things out. I said yes, of course, but I suspect a few weeks is optimistic. That girl has been through enough. October 15th. Sarah's been here 3 days. She barely speaks, barely eats. Found her crying in the guest room last night, but she wouldn't tell me why. I don't think she trusts adults anymore. Can't say I blame her. October 20th. No word from Margaret or Daniel. Sarah asked when they're coming back. I told her soon, but I'm starting to think never might be more accurate. Part of me hopes I'm right. This child needs stability. November 3rd. Spoke with a family lawyer today about Sarah's situation. If her parents don't maintain contact, I can petition for guardianship. I want to be prepared if that becomes necessary. She deserves better than this uncertainty. The entries continued chronologically, documenting Uncle Robert's growing love for me and his increasing anger at my parents' abandonment. But nowhere in thousands of pages was there any mention of blackmail, coercion, or threats. Instead, there was the portrait of a man who'd fallen in love with the idea of being a father and couldn't understand how anyone could walk away from their child. December 25th. Sarah's first Christmas here. She seemed happy. Really happy for the first time since she arrived. I bought her too many presents probably, but seeing her smile was worth it. I hope her parents never come back. Is that terrible? I don't care if it is. June 15th. Graduation day. Sarah looked so beautiful in her cap and gown. I cried like an idiot. But I don't care who saw. This brilliant, strong, wonderful girl is mine now, as surely as if I'd raised her from birth. Her parents' loss is my greatest gain. The final journal entries written just days before his death were devastating in their honesty and love. The lawyers keep asking about Sarah's biological parents, whether they might contest the will. I hope they try. I hope they come crawling back so Sarah can see exactly who they really are. She's strong enough now to handle the truth. And I've given her every tool she needs to protect herself. If something happens to me before Sarah's ready, I hope she finds these journals. I hope she understands how much joy she brought to my life. I was never her consolation prize. She was never mine either. We were chosen family, the best kind there is. Reading those words, I finally understood what I had to do. The courtroom was packed the morning of my parents' emergency hearing, but I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Mr. Whitmore sat beside me, a thick folder of evidence at his elbow, while Detective Morrison occupied the row behind us with what appeared to be half the financial crimes unit. My parents entered in shackles, looking older and more worn than they had just a month ago. County jail had not been kind to them, but more than that, they carried themselves like people who knew they were grasping at their last hope. Their lawyer, a slick-looking man named Harrison Wells, had the demeanor of someone who specialized in long-shot defenses and Hail Mary strategies. He moved with the confidence of a person used to creating chaos in courtrooms, but I'd done my research. His track record was more impressive on paper than in reality. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to Detective Morrison, as she'd clarified when we'd met earlier, called the hearing to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible courtroom drama and had little patience for theatrics. Mr. Wells, she said, I've reviewed your motion and the accompanying documentation. You're alleging that your client's previous guilty plea was entered under duress due to newly discovered evidence of coercion by the deceased Robert Mitchell. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. My clients were loving parents who were forced to make an impossible choice. Abandon their daughter or face decades in prison for crimes that Robert Mitchell threatened to expose. And you have evidence of this alleged coercion? Wells stood and approached the bench with a folder that looked impressively thick, but I suspected contained more style than substance. We have correspondence between Robert Mitchell and my clients dating back 8 years. Your Honor, letters that clearly show Mr. Mitchell using their past mistakes as leverage to keep them away from their daughter. Judge Morrison accepted the folder and began reading while the courtroom waited in tense silence. I watched my parents' faces, looking for any sign of doubt or guilt about their accusations. Instead, I saw only desperation and the grim determination of people with nothing left to lose. After several minutes, the judge looked up. Mr. Wells, these letters appear to be copies. Do you have the originals? Unfortunately, not, Your Honor. My clients were living transient lifestyles during this period and weren't able to preserve the original documents. I see. And the bank records you've submitted as corroborating evidence, they show suspicious financial transactions that my clients believe were Robert Mitchell's way of monitoring their activities. Judge Morrison handed the folder back to Wells with an expression that suggested she was unimpressed. Mr. Whitmore, I assume you have a response to these allegations. Mr. Whitmore stood, and I felt a surge of confidence. He'd been practicing law longer than I'd been alive, and his reputation was built on thorough preparation and absolute honesty. We do, Your Honor. In fact, we have substantial evidence that not only contradicts Mr. Wells's claims, but proves that his clients are deliberately making false accusations in an attempt to avoid the consequences of their criminal behavior. Proceed. First, the letters Mr. Wells has submitted are forgeries. The paper, ink, and printing methods are all inconsistent with documents from 8 years ago. We have a forensic document analyst prepared to testify to that fact. Wells objected immediately. Your Honor, we haven't had time to properly examine. You'll have your chance to cross-examine any expert witnesses, Judge Morrison cut him off. Continue, Mr. Whitmore. Second, we have Mr. Mitchell's personal journals kept daily for 20 years, which document his relationship with Miss Sarah Mitchell in real time. These journals show a man who fell in love with the idea of being a father and was grateful for the opportunity to raise a child whose biological parents had abandoned her. Mr. Whitmore gestured to me and I stood to address the court. Your Honor, I'd like to read a brief excerpt from my uncle's journal written 1 month after I came to live with him. Judge Morrison nodded permission. I opened the journal to the page I'd marked, my voice steady despite the emotion of the words. Sarah asked me today if I thought her parents would come back for Christmas. I told her I didn't know, but privately I hope they don't. She's starting to smile again, starting to trust. If they came back now, they'd just hurt her again when they left. Some people aren't meant to be parents. Some people are meant to step in when the real parents fail. The courtroom was completely silent as I closed the journal. That doesn't sound like the thoughts of a man who was blackmailing anyone, I continued. That sounds like the thoughts of someone who loved me enough to hope my biological parents would stay away permanently. Objection, Wells called out. Hearsay. The defendant can testify to her own experiences, Judge Morrison replied. Overruled. Mr. Whitmore resumed his presentation, methodically destroying every aspect of my parents' story. Bank records showed that Uncle Robert had never monitored their financial activities. He'd hired investigators to track their criminal activities, which was completely different. Phone records proved they'd never received threatening calls from him. Most damning, their own investigators' reports showed they'd been actively trying to locate me and Uncle Robert for years. Behavior completely inconsistent with people being coerced into staying away. Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore concluded, the defendants are career criminals facing significant prison time who have decided to launch a desperate attack on a man who can no longer defend himself. They're hoping to create enough doubt to negotiate a better plea agreement, but their lies are easily exposed by the documentary evidence. Judge Morrison looked at my parents for a long moment. Mr. Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have anything to say before I rule on this motion? My father stood shakily. Your Honor, we know we made mistakes, but we loved our daughter. We were young. We were addicted. We made bad choices, but we never stopped loving her. Mr. Mitchell, I'm not questioning whether you loved your daughter. I'm questioning whether you're telling the truth about Robert Mitchell's alleged coercion. We are telling the truth, my mother said, standing beside my father. He threatened us. He said he'd make sure we went to prison for decades if we ever contacted Sarah. Then why, Judge Morrison asked, do the investigators' reports show that you were actively trying to locate your daughter as recently as last year? The silence that followed was devastating. My parents looked at each other, then at their lawyer, then at the floor. We wanted to see how she was doing, my father finally said weakly. But you just testified that Robert Mitchell threatened you with exposure if you made contact. Which is it, Mr. Mitchell? Were you too afraid to contact your daughter? Or were you actively trying to find her? Wells jumped to his feet. Your Honor, my clients were conflicted about their situation. Your clients are lying, Mr. Wells, Judge Morrison said flatly. The evidence presented here today shows a clear pattern of deception designed to avoid accountability for their criminal actions. She turned to address my parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, making false accusations against a deceased person in an attempt to manipulate the legal system is contempt of court. I'm imposing an additional 6 months on any sentence you ultimately receive. Wells looked like he wanted to object, but thought better of it. Furthermore, the judge continued, your original plea agreement is hereby reinstated. 12 years concurrent sentences with the additional 6 months for contempt. Do you understand? My parents nodded miserably. Miss Mitchell, Judge Morrison said, turning to me, I want to commend you for your dignity throughout this process. It takes considerable courage to stand up to family members even when they're in the wrong. As the bailiff led my parents away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not enough to forgive them, not enough to ask for leniency, but enough to recognize that they were people who'd made catastrophically bad choices and were now facing the full weight of those decisions. Outside the courthouse, Detective Morrison congratulated me on the outcome, but I felt oddly empty. This should have been a victory, but instead it felt like the closing of a book I'd never wanted to read in the first place. You okay? Jenny asked as we walked to our cars. I think so. It's just, final, you know. Before today, there was always some tiny part of me that wondered if they might change, if they might become different people. Now I know they won't. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I considered this. No, I don't think it is. It means I can stop waiting for them to become the parents I needed and focus on being the person Uncle Robert raised me to be. And who is that person? Someone who builds things instead of tearing them down. Someone who protects kids instead of abandoning them. Someone who tells the truth even when lies would be easier. As we drove back toward the warehouse that would soon house our nonprofit, I felt Uncle Robert's presence in the car with me. Not in a supernatural sense, but in the values he'd instilled, the strength he'd helped me develop, the love he'd shown me every day for 8 years. My parents had finally gotten what they'd always wanted. They were free of the responsibility of caring about me. The irony was that their freedom came in the form of a prison cell, while mine came in the form of letting go of the hope that they'd ever be different. Some victories don't feel like celebrations, but they're victories nonetheless. 6 weeks after the courthouse drama, Jenny and I stood in the partially renovated warehouse, watching contractors install kitchen fixtures in what would become our first residence common area. The transformation was remarkable. What had been empty concrete and exposed beams was becoming something that actually looked like a home. The fire marshal signed off on the residential permits this morning, Jenny reported, checking her tablet. And the state licensing board approved our nonprofit status. We're officially ready to start accepting applications. How many kids are on the waiting list now? 47. And that's just from preliminary outreach to social services departments in 3 counties. I'd known the need was significant, but seeing it in numbers was staggering. 47 teenagers who would age out of foster care in the next 12 months with nowhere to go and no support system. Kids like Jenny had been. Like I would have been if Uncle Robert hadn't stepped in. We'll start with 10 residents, I decided. Get our systems working smoothly before we expand. Agreed. I've already identified the first group. 5 girls and 5 boys, ages 17 to 19, all aging out within the next 6 months. My phone rang as we made our way to the office space. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. Miss Mitchell, this is Dr. Patricia Collins from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling about your uncle, Robert Mitchell. I felt my stomach drop. My uncle died 6 months ago, Dr. Collins. I know, and I'm sorry for your loss. I'm calling because your uncle made a request before his death that we contact you if certain circumstances arose. What kind of circumstances? Are you familiar with the children's cancer ward that bears your uncle's name? I stopped walking. I'm sorry. What? The Robert Mitchell Pediatric Oncology Wing. Your uncle funded the construction 5 years ago and he's been the primary donor for our patient support programs ever since. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Uncle Robert had never mentioned anything about hospital donations, and I thought I knew everything about his charitable giving. Dr. Collins, I think there might be some confusion. My uncle was generous, but he wasn't wealthy enough to fund hospital wings. Miss Mitchell, your uncle donated over $2 million to our hospital over the past 5 years. The wing renovation alone cost $1.2 million. I sat down heavily on a paint-covered chair trying to process this information. $2 million. That was more than half of what Uncle Robert had left me, and he'd given it away without ever mentioning it. Why are you calling me now? I managed to ask. Because your uncle established a trust fund for ongoing support, but the funds are running low. He left instructions that if the trust fell below a certain amount, we should contact you to see if you wanted to continue his support. How much does the trust need? About $500,000 annually to maintain current programming. But Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that your uncle never expected you to continue his donations. He was very clear that this was his choice, not an obligation he was passing on to you. After ending the call, I sat in the half-finished office space, staring at the blueprints scattered across my desk. Jenny found me there 20 minutes later. Sarah, you look like you've seen a ghost. I told her about Dr. Collins's call, about the hospital wing I'd never known existed, about the trust fund that had been quietly helping children with cancer for years. That's incredible, Jenny said when I finished. Your uncle was funding a children's hospital wing while also raising you and building his business. It explains some things actually. Why he was always so careful with money. Why he drove that old truck for so many years. Why he never took expensive vacations. He was supporting sick kids. Sick kids whose parents couldn't afford the best care. I pulled up the hospital's website on my phone, searching for information about the Robert Mitchell Wing. What I found took my breath away. The wing wasn't just a sterile medical facility. It was designed to feel like a children's wonderland with murals on every wall, play areas integrated into treatment spaces, and family sleeping rooms so parents could stay close to their children during treatment. The testimonials from families were heartbreaking and inspiring. Parents describing how the wing's design had helped their children cope with chemotherapy. Doctors explaining how the family support programs had improved treatment outcomes. Children's drawings thanking Mr. Robert for making the hospital less scary. "Jenny, look at this," I said, turning my phone so she could see a photo of the wing's main playroom. It looked nothing like a traditional hospital space. Instead, it resembled a magical forest with trees painted on the walls and fiber optic stars twinkling on the ceiling. "It's beautiful. Your uncle had amazing vision. He never told me about any of this. Never once mentioned the hospital or the donations." That sounds like him, though, doesn't it? He wasn't the kind of person who needed credit for doing good things. I thought about Uncle Robert's letters, about his quiet generosity in so many areas of life, about the way he'd raised me without ever making me feel like a burden or an obligation. "I have to continue supporting the hospital," I said suddenly. "Sarah, that's a huge financial commitment, $500,000 a year, plus whatever we need for this place." "I know the numbers, Jenny, but I can't let those kids down. Uncle Robert built something beautiful there. Something that's helping families get through the worst moments of their lives. I won't be the reason it falls apart." Jenny studied my face. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure. We'll make it work somehow." "Actually," Jenny said slowly, "I might have an idea about that." She pulled out her own phone and showed me a news article about corporate charitable giving programs. "What if we positioned our nonprofit as part of a larger charitable network? We could partner with the hospital wing, create programming that serves both populations, kids aging out of foster care and families dealing with medical crisis." "How would that work?" "Think about it. Older foster kids could volunteer at the hospital, gaining work experience while helping younger children. Families dealing with medical bills could receive support from our life skills programs. We could create a comprehensive support network that addresses different types of family crisis." The more Jenny talked, the more excited I became. This wasn't just about continuing Uncle Robert's work. It was about expanding it, creating connections between different vulnerable populations, building something bigger than either program could be alone. "We'd need corporate sponsors," I said, my mind racing through possibilities. "Exactly. Companies love supporting programs that demonstrate measurable community impact. And with your uncle's construction company connections, plus the hospital's established donor network, we'd have a strong foundation for fundraising." "Jenny, this could work. More than that, it could be revolutionary. Comprehensive family support that addresses both immediate crises and long-term stability." We spent the next 3 hours sketching out a preliminary plan for what we started calling the Robert Mitchell Family Support Network. Foster care services, medical family support, educational programs, job training, emergency financial assistance, all under one organizational umbrella. "Your uncle would be proud," Jenny said as we reviewed our notes. "You think so?" "I know so. He saw a girl who needed help and he helped her. Now you're seeing whole communities that need help, and you're figuring out how to help them, too." As we prepared to leave the warehouse, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Absolute certainty about my purpose. Not just continuing Uncle Robert's work, but building on it, expanding it, creating something that would help families in ways I'd never even imagined. My parents had taught me what abandonment looked like. Uncle Robert had shown me what commitment looked like. Now I was learning what legacy really meant. Not just preserving what came before, but using it as a foundation to build something even better. The scared 18-year-old who'd arrived at Uncle Robert's house 8 years ago could never have imagined standing in this warehouse, planning programs that would help hundreds of families. But that girl's pain had become a woman's purpose. And her purpose was about to become something transformational. Tomorrow, Jenny and I would start calling potential corporate sponsors. Next week, we'd present our proposal to the hospital board. Next month, we'd welcome our first residents to a program that offered not just housing, but connection to a larger community of support. And somewhere, Uncle Robert was smiling. The corporate boardroom at Pinnacle Industries was everything I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, and an intimidation factor that was clearly intentional. But after months of planning and preparing, I felt ready for whatever questions they might throw at me. "Miss Mitchell," said Patricia Hawthorne, Pinnacle's Chief Community Relations Officer. "Your proposal is certainly ambitious. You're asking for a 5-year commitment of $1.2 million annually to support what is essentially an untested model." "That's correct," I replied calmly. "But the individual components are all proven successful. Foster care support programs, medical family assistance, job training initiatives. We're simply integrating them in a way that creates synergies and eliminates duplication." The 12 executives around the table exchanged glances. I'd learned to read these corporate dynamics over the past month of similar presentations, and I could sense they were intrigued despite their skepticism. "Walk us through a specific example," requested David Chen, the CFO. "How does this integration actually work in practice? Let's say we have an 18-year-old aging out of foster care. Call her Maria. In the traditional system, she'd receive housing assistance from one agency, job training from another, healthcare navigation from a third, and educational support from a fourth. Each agency has its own intake process, its own requirements, its own timeline." I stood and moved to the presentation screen, pulling up our integrated service model. "In our system, Maria lives in our residential facility while participating in job training at the hospital, food service, administrative support, patient relations. She earns money, gains experience, and contributes to the community. When her own health issues arise, she already understands the medical system because she works in it. When she's ready for independent living, she has references, savings, and ongoing support connections." "And the corporate benefit?" asked Miss Hawthorne. "Pinnacle gets measurable impact, positive media attention, and a pipeline of trained employees who understand your company's values because they've been part of your charitable network from the beginning." The questions continued for another hour, covering everything from liability insurance to long-term sustainability metrics. But I could sense a shift in the room's energy. These weren't people trying to find reasons to say no anymore. They were people figuring out how to say yes. "Miss Mitchell," said CEO James Whitfield, speaking for the first time since introductions. "I have to ask about your personal motivation here. You're 26 years old. You've inherited significant wealth and you could be traveling the world or starting your own business. Why are you choosing to dedicate your life to social services?" This was the question I'd been preparing for, the one that required absolute honesty. "Because I know what it feels like to be disposable," I said simply. "I know what it's like to wonder if anyone would notice if you just disappeared. I know what it's like to age into adulthood without the safety net that most people take for granted." The room was completely silent. My uncle saved me from that experience, but he couldn't.